What I am doing today is I'm taking a look inside this Prunus J618 radio. This is an interesting radio because it both can receive Bluetooth signals, but it can also send them from the radio. I started to take this apart and lost my main audio, so rather than just use backup audio, I think I'll just start at this point in the process, and let's see if I can fix that. That's a little better. Okay, so this comes apart quite easily. There are a couple of sticky feet that go between the two halves, and then there are 4 screws. There are no clips. The screws are fairly small considering that there aren't any clips to back them up, but it seems to be all right. This has a built-in battery charged by USB-C. As you can see, it's a pretty chunky one, and on here it says it's 2000 milliamp hours at 3.7 volts, which I believe is what it says on the box. So, yay, no problems there. The other interesting thing about this is that the sound on it is relatively good considering its size, and this little puny 4-ohm 3-watt speaker. But what's interesting about this speaker is that the case mounts the speaker in its own separate enclosure, which is separated from the rest of the enclosure, and that creates a sort of bass reflex-ish kind of like sealed enclosure speaker. Sorry, not bass reflex, opposite of bass reflex, acoustic suspension-ish. Bass reflex is ported. Acoustic suspension in the traditional sense was a sealed enclosure that relied on the back pressure to return the tone to its original position. Anyway, that's not something we need to talk about here. Anyway, but the point is, sealing the enclosure gives you a much less colored sound from a small device like this, so that's pretty neat. And one of the reasons you can do that is that you've got a fair amount of power. So I've taken this apart and I've looked up the chips to the extent that I can find them, which are here on this piece of paper, which I will keep off screen. But let me just point out what we've got here. We've got, this is the LCD driver here. I don't think it's doing much else. This was TM1621B. Date code on this is 2506, which means that this whole thing was manufactured very shortly before I got it. This I can't find. It says JLBP27485, if I'm reading that properly. That was very small, needed that to see it. I think given that there's a crystal, the antenna for the Bluetooth, I think this is the Bluetooth chip. And since I haven't found another chip, I bet this is also handling the reading off the compact flash card. Over here, we have this one here, which is an LP405BH. This is most likely the battery charge monitor and controller. But I will note that the battery has a protection board. Oh, maybe not. There's a circuit board in there, but I'm not sure that I see a protection chip on it. It might just be there to facilitate soldering the lead in. Anyway, it does look like there might be a protection board on there, but in any event, there is a charge control chip there, and that's probably sufficient in its own. That's a pretty hefty battery, right? So you do want a decent charge controller on that for sure. This chip over here, presuming I'm remembering properly, is 8002D, and that looks to be a 2-watt power amplifier. So that's what's driving this little speaker. Now, considering it's got a pretty chunky battery behind it, you can see why the sealed enclosure makes sense in here and wouldn't have in 1970s radios. You've got a chunky, rechargeable battery. You got a 2-watt chip, although I can't imagine without any cooling that it'd be okay. Maybe. So you can drive that at fairly hard, right, in its little sealed enclosure. And then finally, we have the AM/FM receiver chip, which is over here. This is a KT013, which is an AM/FM receiver. And I haven't looked too deeply into that. And I don't know if it's being used on other things. So there's actually quite a lot in here, and you know, this was a little over $40 Canadian. This should be in the low to mid 30s, low 30s US price point, depending on where we are with tariff ridiculousness, and where they are in the US, I suppose, not where we are in Canada. But there's quite a lot in here, right? You've got the display driver, you've got the LCD, you've got all the buttons and stuff, which we're not seeing because I'm not going to disassemble it. So look at the other side of the board. We've got crystal here. I'm not sure what that is. That could be another crystal. There must be a crystal for the radio receiver as well. Yes, there it is. Hiding behind the antenna, there is the crystal for the radio receiver. So the radio receiver is pretty well just in this corner here, and everything else is related to the display and the Bluetooth connections that are inherent in this radio. So I think that's really quite interesting. I might do a little more reading up on some of these data sheets. The radio one looked to be mainly in Chinese, so I'm not sure I'll get that far with it. But I'll tell you, looking in this answers a question that I've had for a long time, which is, why has there been such a tendency to go to dial displays like this in simple, inexpensive radios? You know, why not just use a digital display, right? When you look at this, you can see that there's fairly substantial costs involved in that. You need the display controller, you need, you know, whatever electronics are required to talk to those. You also need a transistor, which presumably is turning the backlight on and off, right? There's a lot of stuff that you have to add. So the once you've figured out how to make these little dials, which J618 certainly has, once you've figured out how to make the dials cheaply, that's much cheaper than all this stuff. And well, I like dials in radios. I kind of think a digital radio should have a digital display, so I've always been a bit, had some questions about this tendency, but you can, as soon as you see the inside of this, you can easily see why manufacturing this is more expensive than manufacturing something like this, right? It's not just down to the battery and charge controller and whatnot. It's like, this is just so much simpler. And I do have a teardown of this this radio as well. If you look for the J618D220 look inside video on my list, you'll see this one. So hopefully that was interesting. As I said, I quite like this little radio, and I may be looking at some other similar things in the future. Hopefully this was helpful for you. Thanks for watching.